Welcome to Her Time to Talk. I'm Megan Clark, a licensed professional counselor and the founder of Her Time Therapy, a group practice dedicated to supporting women's mental health. This podcast is for women, by women, and is all about creating a safe place for our experiences, amplifying our voices, and empowering each other with the knowledge to improve our mental health. Today, I'm here with Nicole. I'm so excited for our talk. We're going to be focusing on fertility issues and talking a lot about the mental health influence. I'm really fortunate to have Nicole join us today. Nicole, I want to welcome you to Her Time to Talk and invite you to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Thank you for having me, Megan. I'm so excited to be here. My name's Nicole Lange. I have done fertility through the lens of Chinese medicine and education-focused work since 2006. And I have a specific lens on trauma-informed and evidence-based ways that we can bump into those specific things. So Chinese medicine, fertility, trauma, and science. I put them all together. And it's such a joy and such an amazing moment to be practicing all these things because it's tried and true medicine with increasing amounts of evidence, and then putting the mental health back into the mainstream scientific medicine, and it just better serves whole, complex humans.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We can't just go with one methodology anymore. We really do need the intersection and the wisdom from all of those areas. That is so insightful that you've merged those in particular.
Yeah, I heard a MD talking about trying to reintegrate or integrate actually for the first time. Modern medicine has never had the mind in the scientific training of the siloed body piece kind of training. And so he's trying to advocate for putting it into that training for the first time ever since the 1500s. And he said, at this point, there's so much evidence that shows how much the mental health and the physical body are interconnected, that if you're doing one without the other, you're not actually practicing evidence-based medicine. I was like, that is a mic drop moment. I love it.
Absolutely. Mic drop indeed. And on one hand, how sad is it that it took this long to recognize that? And yet better late than never. I'm so glad to hear that it's going that way on a really large scale. It's long overdue.
Better late than never.
Yeah. So to start us off, you are one of those practitioners called to this work because of your own lived experience and personal journey. I would love to start there and invite you to tell our listeners about your personal journey into this fertility struggle work and the overlap of trauma and Chinese medicine.
It was the trauma piece for me. I benefited tremendously when it came to my fertility journey, but I didn't know that when I started doing this work. For me, I had childhood ACEs and a lot of intensity in my nervous system already. And then at 17, I experienced a sexual assault and attempted suicide and ended up in the intensive care unit of the hospital, the regular hospital, and then psychiatric ward. It was just this horrible upheaval of everything that I thought I knew where my life was going. I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew a lot of things, as 17-year-olds do. And all of a sudden, that was all topsy-turvy and totally unknown. Western mainstream medicine absolutely saved my life. I thought I was going to practice some form of mainstream medicine prior to all of this, but it just got me as far as it could take me and stabilized me, but couldn't connect the dots. And there was so much that was mental health and trauma in my body, in my digestion, my menstrual cycle, my sleep, and my way of being in the world. So I came to Chinese medicine looking for those things for myself. And because I'm a firstborn overachiever kiddo with a lot of ACEs, I was like, I'm gonna get my master's in this. I'm not just gonna go for some appointments. I showed up totally clueless about anything really traditional. I knew that there was going to be some Western medicine in the training, and that was really appealing to me. Then I learned all the ways that Chinese medicine really does two things that I think are really important now in hindsight. It never took out the mind from the mind body. And so now here we are, 2025, trying to put it into mainstream science for the first time, but Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, medicines like this never separated them. And it's always been multi-systemic. You're not ever just doing this siloed, oh, you have this period problem, that's this, and you have this sleep problem, that's this, like I was so used to Western medicine doing. So I worked on myself, I ended up connecting all the dots and doing the mental, physical at the same time. And I benefited tremendously. So by the time I decided to start a private practice when I was graduating, I really wanted to do trauma work. And one of my professors is like, yeah, maybe since you're not a therapist, think about what that bumps into. So I said, okay, let's do women's health with an emphasis on emotional health. And within 6 months from starting my practice, I had a wait list that was predominantly fertility work because of the way I practiced. I was explaining a lot of things, taking time and being very nervous system focused. And that appealed to people going through fertility. And I didn't know at the time until I tried to have my own kiddos, but I turned out I had PCOS and endometriosis, and all the things I was doing for all the other things showed up in my own fertility journey too. So that's a long answer, but it's kind of a everything informs everything else story.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We are not simple beings, right? We
Right.
have experiences that build on each other and really impact a lot of who we are and what we do. So I think it all makes a lot of sense. And for those of you who are not sure what ACE is it's an assessment that we tend to give a lot in the mental health field that takes into account the childhood traumas that you've been through growing up, like divorce, neglect, childhood sexual assault, things like that will give you a higher ACE score. And those that tend to have a higher ACE score are the ones that are more likely to have PTSD qualifying symptoms and other comorbid mental health conditions. And the lower on the ACE score you are, doesn't necessarily save you from those things. You can still struggle with anxiety and depression, but it's not quite as likely. So just want to give our listeners
Yeah.
that little background there. But
I love when you give the context, your narcissism breakdown and one of the
yes.
first episodes I listened to, I was like, beautiful. Yes, and we know you are exponentially more likely to have autoimmune disorders if you have higher ACEs scores, cardiovascular disease, which makes sense because, again, mind body are one and the same. And when your nervous system gets wired to be on high alert without rest, it tends to make our blood pressure higher. It tends to make our immune system do dysregulated things because we can't always be on the alert for a tiger. Our immune system doesn't do well in that place. So it's not just the anxiety and the risk for mental health, but it goes with that physiology too.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, your story here is not really unique, especially in the clients that we treat at Her Time. We see this over and over of women in particular going to the traditional medical field asking for help. They get some help to the extent that they can, but they do feel left out and let down a lot of times. If we look at the history, women were not required to be in medical studies until 1993. So it is not surprising that in 2025, we're still feeling really misunderstood and let down by the siloed traditional medical model. In a big way, people are turning to therapy and non traditional medicine fields for that gaps to be filled in. It's just so prevalent right now. I'm really glad that you are living proof that there's hope for women in that spot that
Yeah.
are feeling let down and that healing can happen.
We're at this perfect moment, I think. I mean, like as you doing EMDR and ART and these somatic mind body things that we do from a mental health perspective that involve our eyes moving or feeling buzzing. Acupuncture turns out to be very similar in a lot of ways. Like it's tapping into the nervous system and it's processing. So it can do things that talking alone and medicine alone don't touch. It's just a really fantastic time to be having conversations like this. And it's easier and easier to find these kinds of modalities and know the evidence behind them. Even placebo, we know, is good medicine now. We can do
Mhm.
open label placebo where we're telling people placebo is powerful because it's neurochemicals, it's electrical signals, it's your body healing itself. And we don't have to trick anybody. It makes good medicine even better when there's those layers.
Yeah. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the trauma aspect because you gave us this very vulnerable summary of your childhood, rife with some very traumatic moments. I'm wondering if, from a personal and scientific perspective, you can kind of walk us through how does trauma impact women in terms of their fertility journey? Where's the
Yeah.
connection between those pieces?
Yeah. It is just so nebulous and multi-systemic, which is something that, again, I think more mind body modalities are really good at. All the things that I already alluded to, the immune system changes, There's immunity involved in implantation and a pregnancy thriving or not thriving. The uterine lining, implantation, and building of a placenta. This relates to the circulatory system and whether the blood is being shunted away from the rest, digest, and reproduce organs or towards them based on our nervous system. There's every single system you could go through, your endocrine system, your hormonal system, when our body is flooded with never ending, unrelenting cortisol and stress cycles that we either can't turn off because our nervous system is primed because of things like PTSD, or we're in a culture. One of the layers that I'm really passionate about is how fertility treatment and culture activate our nervous systems and our fight or flight. Some of us have PTSD, some of us have ACEs, so we're already more prone to activate stronger, faster. When you put all this together, one of the things we can see from a hormonal perspective is the cortisol that surges out, that's made out of the same building blocks as your reproductive hormones are. There's this robbing effect from one kind of hormone to the other. Even if we're doing outside treatments, which I work with a lot of people that are doing both Western and Eastern medicine. So say we're taking these outside hormones and we're adding them in the form of medications and shots and patches, which is fabulous that we can do these things. But the receptors, because the building blocks are the same, the receptors can get jammed up with some of the stress hormones. So when we're doing this system of medicine that's like, well, you can put your life on hold for now, and when you have a baby, you can take it off and deal with your mental health. That is so old fashioned. That is not understanding this current science in real ways that influence our fertility. And not just our fertility, like pregnancy rates, but how healthy is that pregnancy? How healthy is that placenta? How high risk is that? And that influences the mental health and the confidence of the person who's carrying that pregnancy and how they're going into becoming a parent. I say all the time, if the bare minimum is just get you pregnant, even if it's traumatic, and the best case scenario is somebody then hands you a newborn, that's a terrible setup on so many levels. Versus we could serve women, we could serve people as they go through fertility struggles. We could make it less traumatic, less activating in so many different ways. We can offset the ways that it has to be triggering because it is a legitimate medical condition, have more tools and more skills and bigger buffers so that going into having a newborn is that much more informed by all sorts of wonderful things.
There's just so much to that. And I think a lot of women that maybe want to have children are finding that that's not as simple as they thought it would be. They are intimidated by this whole world of IVF is a very kind of common treatment that is widespread in terms of we know the name of it, but we don't really know what it's like to experience that or whatever the alternatives are. For
Yeah.
someone thinking about that, but that really hasn't gone through it and doesn't know what that's like, can you describe what is the typical medical model of what that experience is like versus maybe what should it be like in your opinion?
The typical way is through reproductive sex education. You just show up, have things prescribed, and you take them, and they either work or they don't work. So if I had to distill it down to a nutshell, that's how we've historically treated, whether it's endometriosis pain and just throwing people on birth control pills, or PCOS where people don't ovulate regularly because of insulin resistance and hormonal imbalances. And so we just try to make them ovulate. These are things that can be effective treatments, but when they're done in that void of any context or education or confidence, again, we're missing out all those layers. We're causing unnecessary harm. We're activating nervous systems. We're hurting the outcomes by making it less robust reproductive function than it could. We're hurting mental health. Ideally, what I would like is to see us strip down what is required medical treatment and then what can we add to enhance it versus what can we tolerate to just get through it. So that's a very high level. And I'm passionate about explaining the reductionistic pieces, like to your example, somebody's thinking about doing IVF. IVF has, I would say at this point at most clinics, three main protocols for stimulating the ovaries to grow as many eggs as possible at once so they can be retrieved and fertilized in the lab. Then they can either put an embryo into the uterus immediately on the heels of that egg stimulation retrieval cycle, or freeze those embryos, do testing, and then do one of three main protocols to get the uterine lining ready for implantation. So sort of 3 basic protocols for the egg stimulation retrieval, 3 basic protocols for the lining preparation and implantation process. But within that, so many opportunities for people to feel educated and confident and follow along and get nuanced and all the things that feel really empowering. And again, even when I started 20 years ago, it's like, oh, that will make you stress less. And now 20 years in, it's like, this actually makes your outcomes so much better. Here's all the science of how we know why.
And when you lay it out that way, it seems very scientific. It's just a handful of steps. We just take this medication and then here we go. But in
Not at all.
reality,
It bumps up into everything. Like people are like, oh, well, it's whether you have a baby or not. But it's comparing where you thought your life would be. It's your sense of purpose as a person. It's your relationship to your body. It's your spirituality. It can rock people's faith. It's this inequitable distribution of treatment burden and mental load. You talk a lot about these things. This applies in fertility treatment. It's falling out of alignment with your peers and your cohort, with your life. I have a fertility program, an IVF program, where I explain the timelines. Here's the different medications. Here's how to troubleshoot. Here's what the evidence says, because that is a big piece for mental health and for outcomes and physiology. But then at the same time, how do you hold the unknown? How do you advocate for healthy boundaries? How do you tell your partner when you're on a different page with them what you would need to feel more supported and get on the same page so you can be experiencing it with the person that's your nearest ally in this, even though their experience is really different. And so, yeah, it's simple and incredibly complex, nuanced, and personal. And I love that because, again, that makes it incredibly nuanced and elegant and beautiful to be able to enter in and see what will give somebody the biggest bang for the buck or what is in service to each individual person. Never a supplement, never a let's just magically change your diet in this way. It's always way more whole person and person centric.
I want to take a moment here to read a quote from your website that I pulled and wrote down because I think it ties in really well here. On your page, you said, trying to conceive for 2+ years leaves women with as high or even higher levels of anxiety and depression as having cancer. Yet, if you had cancer, others would know what to say. They would bring meals and flowers, but with fertility, not so much. I think that quote encapsulates what you're talking about here. This journey can ultimately be very traumatic and grief-ridden, and people don't even see it happening. And that can compound that problem and make it that much worse.
That's a unique layer to fertility that we treat it as other than other legitimate medical conditions like cancer. When I started listening to your podcast, there were a couple of episodes that jumped out because they were talking about unhealthy relationships and abusive signs and things like that. And I was like, oh my goodness, not doctors as individuals, not nurses as individuals, not acupuncturists as individuals, but as a culture. Fertility culture has a lot of the same qualities as abusive relationships. There's all this weird shame and blame and gaslighting and isolation and messed up power dynamics and exploitation of, all different kinds of icky things that we do not see in oncology or cardiovascular medicine. And it is so strange that it is every bit as legitimate of a medical condition as any of these other things, but this is not how this field of medicine, not how patients dealing with this form of medical need have to operate within a system that doesn't operate like it should. Those are the parts that are unnecessarily harmful. Those are the parts that I was wanting to challenge and talk about in every single podcast I do, because we could demand better. We could say, okay, this is a legitimate medical condition.
Yeah.
We deserve XYZ.
Absolutely. We do deserve better. And women, I think a big part of this is helping women learn how to advocate in these medical spaces for what they deserve and what they need so that this abusive relationship nature of it doesn't perpetuate. So it's like we're a victim of the system while we're having to fix it.
Yes.
And that feels like a uniquely female problem that we have to rebuild the society while being harmed by it. And that's endlessly frustrating and a true women's mental health issue at the core.
True. And as you said, we haven't paid to study this. The beginning of that quote that you just shared, that's from a woman named Alice Domar's work in the 90s, where she was piloting a 10-week mind-body program for people going through fertility. And they actually cut off the study early because they considered it unethical to withhold the treatment because the success rates were so much higher in people doing mind-body support while going through fertility struggle. This was in the 90s and still not built in. It seems like if you're lucky enough to be able to afford it, or if you stumble on the right information on the right podcast, or a friend of a friend, or you have a more cutting edge RE who's going to refer you to somebody like me. But it should be like in oncology. I think in oncology, there's so many more holistic mind body supports that are built into that. It's understood that it's trajectory of life and lack of control and all of the mental health layers.
And cancer patients, for example, are not blamed for their situation. There can be moments where it's like if you smoked and you had lung cancer, there can be that I told you so elements, but it's not outwardly stated. In fertility culture, it's kind of like the woman's fault.
You didn't find a partner in time, or you should have known, or come off the pill sooner. I talk about this in my 90-day where I go from the ground up. Even in the financial structure of it, it's like there's nowhere else in medicine that's like, well, if you're poor enough prognosis, we're going to say, no, we're not going to treat you. We'll offer you these other treatments, but not the treatment that you want to do because it might not work and we don't want to mess our statistics up. That is common practice in reproductive medicine. And that just takes away any sense of control. Even if you had a really significant metastatic cancer, there's these heroic measures, trials, things that if that's what a person feels they need to do to make peace with things, that is an option. In mainstream fertility culture, that's not how it works. There's also pay up front. There's not many places in legitimate medicine where it's like, nope, you can't do this thing today until you pay us $3,000 at the front desk. Happens all the time in fertility. You're lucky if you get fertility benefits through insurance in many places in the United States. That doesn't happen in most areas of our health. And also there's these interesting payment plans called share risk payment plans where you pay for like 3 IVFs. And if the first one works, you lose the extra money. But if none of them work, you get your money back. And not to judge because I'm so risk averse, I think that would probably help my mental health to do something like that. But imagine, okay, we're going to give you 3 stents for your heart disease. And if you still die of a heart attack, we'll give your family some of the money back. If you never need a second stent, we're just going to keep the money. It's such an interesting, unnecessary culture of harms.
Even the financial dynamic around this is completely different than any other area of medicine. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because we have assumed that it's a personal failure and not a medical condition. It's like the Wild West of treatment. It's a lot of private owned clinics, a lot of for-profit clinics. It's so new. It doesn't have a lot of research. Some of the reasons why insurance historically have said they're not interested in paying for fertility treatments is because it does tend to increase the burden of the finances on the insurance company. Historically, a lot of fertility treatments would end up with not singleton pregnancies, it would be twins or higher level multiples, which cost insurance companies a lot of money. So things like oral medications and just insemination or at-home timed intercourse, for example, or early IVF protocols would end up with multiples. And these pregnancies are exorbitantly costly compared to and higher risk. And so insurance companies could say, no, we're not going to do that because there's not a cost benefit for us as an insurance company to cover this industry. There's a large push for single embryo transfers and more access to IVF where you can control and decrease the risk of multiples in ways that insemination cannot. There's so many ways, so many conditions that feed into it. And I think one of the biggest things is some of these things we have control over and we can make changes unfairly on our own, right or wrong. That's where they're going to come from to start. And then some of them are just awareness and calling for advocacy, signing petitions, writing to our lawmakers and doing things like that are out of our control. But combining them does feel empowering, does feel proactive in a way that if you know that the whim of the industry will never feel good.
Yeah. And to do some of these action steps that are within our control, like advocating to our representatives, we also need to name what's happening and become more aware of it and have discussions like this where we're calling out the double standards. This area that is very centrally women's health is treated completely different. Let's look at that. There's probably some discrimination and some issues happening there that are vastly unethical.
And we can start by even just pushing back on our clinics. I train staff and physicians and try to teach from all different angles to change this culture. I was once teaching a group of IVF nurses, and one of the nurses was like, I noticed all your patients always want all their numbers and measurements and how many eggs they're growing in their IVF. Like, why? It's not going to change what they get. And I was like, imagine an oncology patient coming in for a scan of their tumor, and you think it's strange that they want to know if it's shrinking, stable, or growing. It's not going to change what the chemo's doing. They're still in the process of doing the treatment, but of course they would want to know. And this is the same. The trajectory of the life is hanging in the balance, and not knowing is cognitively brutal. I always say, if I could tell you, you're going to have 5 terrible twists and turns, but ultimately you end up with a son, you'd be like, okay, versus I don't know. I don't know when this ends. I don't know how this ends. That's so much worse. Any information that we can demand or expect as part of good treatment is in service to this shift and this change that made.
Absolutely. That piece speaks a lot to the grief that is inherently wrapped up in this kind of journey. Fertility struggles has a lot of invisible loss, or what we would call in the mental health field disenfranchised grief, that is not widely viewed or understood or supported. I'm wondering, from your perspective personally and professionally, how you navigated that, because there is so much grief of the I hope this happens, but there's no guarantee. That's a real loss.
It is a real loss. And every single month, it's a series of ups and a rally for ovulation, or this cycle looks like it's going well as far as the treatment protocol, and then getting your hopes up, and then trying to be guarded to protect yourself, and then finding out that there's attrition in IVF where you lose numbers every step of the way and start out with 20 eggs, could end up with 1 embryo and a 50-50 shot at pregnancy. So there's just these miniature losses and miniature griefs and this roller coaster. And we expect people to continue to lead meetings at work, continue to show up, continue to go to the family thing where 5 people are announcing they're pregnant in the course of a year. There's double standards that we can call out and that we can challenge in this way too, because it is. And I think this first step is just acknowledging and talking about it. And again, right or wrong, we have to advocate and ask for it. A big part of my work is grief work. So when you walk into my clinic, there's an altar with statues that I make of a Jizo. Jizo is a deity in Japanese culture that is thought to help the spirits of unborn babies go between rounds of existence. And in Japan, they put Jizos in their yards and in their parks and along the roadsides to honor miscarriage, stillbirth, and infancy loss. I want people to come in and see that even if you're pregnant and excited, getting the nursery ready, but it came after 3 years of trying 2 IVFs and a pregnancy loss. It's like, this is a part of your journey, and that pregnancy or those losses feel like in your heart there's no right or wrong way to do it, but there's a space to light candles, to leave notes, to take a moment and reflect in the space, because it never goes away.
I love that altar idea so much. And even just the education that you're giving about this deity and this cultural aspect that they can choose to lean into with their grief or not, that actually gives a funnel and outlet to release that grief and those emotions and have it be externalized and seen, instead of buried inside and kept in this place where it only grows and festers. So that's one beautiful example of the way that you're helping clients work through the grief of this. And I can see how that would ultimately be critical to building resiliency to keep going and try again the next time.
Yeah. So many of your shows talk about what we control is primarily internal. There's definitely advocacy, things that we're going to try to do on the outside, but ultimately it lands in what is our framework for the expectation, what this level of grief can or should or is in us. What are our expectations for our capacity to understand what's being done to our bodies and be proactive and be nuanced and be an advocate for ourselves? If something is intolerable, the way to make it more tolerable is to have a purpose, to have meaning, to have a reframe. So I do is those things with really fantastic nervous system resets with acupuncture. But the acupuncture without those resets and those reframes are, what do you get to do acupuncture 3 times a week for the rest of your life? I would much rather a person have the nervous system regulation and the skill set and the tools and the framework to get back there and build up their buffers.
For women going through this journey who are struggling with the trauma of it, the anxiety, the grief, the identity struggles of, am I going to be a mom or not? What would you say is the ideal team that you would like to see each of these women build around themselves? Because it clearly from your work, the acupuncture element is a really big one. Mental health therapy and having therapists on their side could be another, but describe to me what is that ideal kind of integrative team that if we
Yeah,
could design the
the
perfect
dream
world
team.
for
I'm working on
the
it. I'm
dream
working on
team.
it. I
Okay.
huge fan of trauma informed therapy. So ART, EMDR, IFS therapies, anything that has good evidence for trauma informed. And again, whether you had prior trauma or you're in the years of fertility that will induce trauma, a really important statistic is 46% of people that go through fertility struggles have PTSD, usually complex PTSD, whether or not they have a baby. So the assumption is if I'm planning on having a baby, this has to end with a baby. You can tolerate things by having that, but not everybody does. And even when they do, it's still traumatic. So the dream team is mental health, trauma informed mental health, and somatic therapy. So whether that is a yoga practice, whether that is an acupuncture practice, whether that is whatever sort of dance, movement. I love Bessel van der Kolk's list of singing, dancing, roller skating, and all the things that can help our bodies and our nervous system. Basically, it's doing things that we would only do if we're safe. And then that
Yeah.
tells our nervous system, hey, if we're dancing or we're singing or we're roller skating, we're safe. Acupuncture is unique in that it mimics in brain scans and brain activity what really good meditators can do in their brains without having to be a really good meditator. If you're really good at meditating and you're doing a really deep meditation, safe and regulated. But if you haven't cultivated that, acupuncture can actually create that state in a brain and a nervous system. So that's pretty unique and pretty magical for people that have access and appealing. But again, I can do that and they can walk out the door and undo it by more trauma and more weird cultural things that they're not aware of. So yeah, I would do some sort of somatic therapy, body kind of work, some sort of trauma informed mental health. And then 25% of what I do in my programs is really dialing in on the reproductive reductionistic pieces. Also, as big picture as you need to be, you have to know if you're anovulatory, like what's going on with your hormones and how to start ovulating. You have to know if you have massive inflammation from endometriosis and things like that, untreated bacterial vaginosis. You have to be able to troubleshoot that. So finding good clinicians that will listen and will actually try to get to the root. What happens for a lot of clinicians is just like, yeah, just hop on the conveyor belt. Doesn't matter if you have inflammation. We're just going to get a good embryo and get your lining and put it in there for 20 grand. And it's like, oh, that's not as likely to work. More likely to have complications. Let's actually get to the root. And then you might still need IVF if you don't have open fallopian tubes or you're dealing with age and you need donor eggs or things like that. It's totally legit. No shame, no blame, no extra suffering needed for that. But if you do it within the context of the person being regulated and getting their hormones sorted out first, so much better. If you're going to do an IVF clinic, it needs to be really good reductionistic people with a really good IVF lab, because that's the thing that people just are like, it's my fault, I'm broken. More of that cultural ick. They just think I'm lucky if I can find an IVF clinic that can help me have a baby, versus this is a top tier treatment. And the clinic, whether their lab is set up, whether they're doing really evidence based, proactive stuff, can influence your outcome. I teach people how to look at things like statistics in the United States, that's the Society of Assisted Reproductive Therapies, and can tell if they're comparing different clinics, like what's a good clinic, how can you tell, all of that. So again, it's a lot of pieces.
Ultimately, the answer here is your individual dream team is going to look different for every person. And it should include these elements, and the more support, the better. But you may need to search around a little bit to figure out, would you benefit more from EMDR therapy or IFS? Or do you need a CBT therapist on your side along with an acupuncturist? Maybe the message here is to give women some encouragement to shop around, to Do consultations, ask questions, and build your own dream team that feels right, and trusting your own nervous system in that.
Check out a website, have a conversation with somebody. If somebody says that they're somatic and they're evidence-based and they're trauma-informed, and then you start talking to them and they're like, I want you to go gluten-free and sugar-free and dairy-free and no caffeine. And I'm going to test every single part of your body. I'm going to test your hair. I'm going to test your stool. I'm going to test your saliva.
Mhm.
That is incredibly activating. And there may be
Mhm.
pieces in that that might be in service, but within that context of total overwhelm, it's one step forward and five steps back. So we have to be able to say everything that we're considering has to be done. And again, there are things that are going to be triggering in a legitimate medical. You can't go through cancer treatment without having things feel threatening. You can't go through fertility treatment without things being threatening. There's 15 layers that don't need to be, that often are. And then there's the two that inherently must be. And you're going to tolerate those two and deal with them a lot better and come through a lot more safe and regulated if you know what's what.
It really seems like the key of what you offer is, of course, the acupuncture treatment itself, but more so the education on these are the two that are going to be hard no matter what. And these
Mhm.
are great areas to bring in the mental health support to help
Yeah.
you cope through those and make it as tolerable as possible and get through it. But ultimately, yeah, it's about let's reduce the suffering where it can be reduced because it doesn't need to be across the board.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a
Yeah.
huge part of what I do. Half of my hours per week are in clinic with patients, and then the other half is generating content because I never want to be the bottleneck. I want people to be able to go to my YouTube and my newsletter and my courses and my blog and get information so that if they can't afford it or they don't have access to somebody who feels right for their nervous system, or it's just a way to start getting more information as a springboard, that is something that I really feel like I hope by the time I retire, I've chipped away at this culture and the patriarchy and the doctor
Mhm.
centricness of it all. And we're really serving women and families and babies a lot better.
Absolutely. And you are already chipping away at that goal. Just with the amount of free resources you have on your website and that you give out is really helping women in the lens of accessibility as well. Something we haven't touched on too deeply here is the financial aspect of this in general. But on top of that, women of color have an even
Mhm.
bigger gender pay gap. And that makes the possibility of doing something like IVF with this very exploitative pay structure much farther out of reach and more damaging to their mental health. So you're helping that end of things as well.
And full circle, the generational trauma that comes with intersectionality, like coming from a family that has dealt with enslaved trauma and
Yeah.
immigrant trauma, actually increases rates of fertility struggles. So infertility is higher in women of color and certain patient populations, which is not surprising through the lens. We're full circle back where we started from. If the body doesn't feel safe, if it isn't able to go into rest, digest, and reproduce, we're going to have more of those immune and circulatory and metabolic things that bump into our fertility and our pregnancies and our family.
To think from a potential client standpoint, if I was a woman of color, which I'm not, so I'm going to honor that and my privilege in that space. But if I was, I would be wondering this $20,000 IVF treatment is so far outside my scope, but I'm struggling in this area. Could I rely on extra treatment like acupuncture and therapy and the combination of these, maybe a little bit more accessible treatments to make an impact on whether or not I could have a baby? Have you seen that alone without these kind of medical model interventions coming in being enough to make a huge difference?
Yeah, for some people, absolutely. And the trick is knowing which camp you're in. There's a model of health called salutogenesis that I'm a real big fan of. And salutogenesis is just this idea that when it comes to any sort of health outcome, about 25% is from troubleshooting pathology. And for some people, that 25 has big, glaring, overt things that need intervention. I alluded to. If you don't have open fallopian tubes, your partner isn't ejaculating any sperm, if you have
Yeah.
zero egg quality because of age, there are things that are absolutely going to be served by troubleshooting that 25%, way beyond going after the other 75%. But the other 75% is creation of wellness and creation of fertility, making your body feel safe, regulating your nervous system, regulating your immune system, regulating your circulatory system, regulating your metabolic function. Absolutely. I've seen many people over the 20 years where it's like, let's start with, I don't know that I can afford or that I want to, from my worldview, whatever, do these treatments. So let's start. And again, 25% of what I do is trying to explain, like, this is what your cycle is telling you. I have people all the time that like, they can go in and say, I think I have this hormonal imbalance. I had a doctor call me once. He's like, are you doing ultrasounds of people and blood work? And I'm like, no, I'm not. He's like, but you're a doctor first and then an acupuncturist, right? And I'm like, no, I'm an acupuncturist and an acupuncturist. And he's like, well, then how everybody that you refer to our clinic knows what they have already. And I'm like, yeah, if you listen to people's bodies and symptoms, there's thousands of years of Chinese medicine saying when you have these 5 things, you probably have this issue. So I'm pretty good at helping people understand if they have the 25% that they really need to chop, get to a treatment, and then they can process and make peace with that, which is a part of the process. So many people, it's something more subtle that has ripples in the 25%, but it's mainly the regulation and the resourcefulness of the body in other ways. And before we froze a lot of embryos earlier in my career, I saw a lot of people that would start seeing me because they were starting or in the thick of IVF. A ton of them had babies afterwards, naturally, holistically. Now I think a lot of people that I work with already have frozen embryos. They don't even try. They just are like, next embryo transfer, which is also lovely. But I know for a fact many people that are like assume that they could only get pregnant via IVF because they've gotten pregnant prior with IVF. So many of them get pregnant, especially when they're paying attention to the big picture stuff.
That's really interesting. I love how it all just boils down to whatever you've got to do to feel safe and to regulate your nervous system, feel safe in your body. And I mean, we could get into this all day, but this speaks to that larger national conversation around birth rates and things like that, that so many women are not feeling safe to make that choice, even if they want to. That's a huge systemic problem that's trickling down through all of these different layers.
Yeah. And we see the outcomes reflect that. It's unacceptable.
Yes.
We know it. And so every single layer, whether it's education for people that are just starting to menstruate, quality of life with hormones and menstrual cycles, trying to conceive, pregnancy and maternal care, postpartum care, through perimenopause, which I'm bumping into in my own life. Every single layer, everything that we've talked about in the context of fertility here, there are versions in every single one of those aspects of our experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have lots of further conversations to have on hopefully future podcast episodes, because I think we just scratched the surface here. But I want to thank you so much for your time, for coming in and sharing your wisdom with us. And just want to give you an invitation here to share anything that we maybe haven't touched on yet, or if there's anything interesting and great coming up in your world that you'd like to offer.
I'm just always chipping away. So I would love people to go to the hub where you can find everything on my website, Life Healing Life, as opposed to Doctor Fixing Patient, lifehealinglife.com. If you go, there's a tab that says online education. If you're in the Twin Cities, there's ways to work with me in person. But online education has links to every single thing that I do, including a conversations tab where all the podcasts that I'm on. So I have ones about perinatal mental health. I have ones about lactation and mental health, trauma and acupuncture and perimenopause and things like that. So if people are wanting other conversations besides fertility rooted in this, there's lots there. And I'm excited to add this episode and your work to my world. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And we look forward to future conversations and working together, maybe part of Future Women's Dream Team. If you're feeling empowered by today's episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. You can also follow us on social media at Her Time to Talk for more updates and tips. And if you'd like to support the show, consider becoming a patron. If you're ready to take the next step in your mental health journey, visit hertimetherapy.com and schedule a free consultation with one of our therapists. Thank you for taking the time to talk today. Remember, your story matters, your voice is powerful, and your mental health is worth prioritizing. Until next time, take care of yourself. This is your time. The information shared on this podcast is not intended to be personal mental health advice, and listening to this podcast does not create a therapeutic relationship between the listener and the therapist featured on this podcast. We encourage listeners to engage with a licensed therapist for personalized mental health treatment and advice.